Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today we're counting down the 5 worst albums of 2017. Alright folks, so this is a list that, just needs to get done. It's not exactly a list I really like doing because, we're talking about the worst stuff here as opposed to the best. My best of the year list should be coming out soon. And down below in the description, if you're curious, is the playlist I have on my channel with all my list videos, including this year's year-end list. Videos, all of them will be in that playlist along with any other lists I've made on my channel before. So if you want to check those out, make sure you do check them out. Make sure you also do check out my best albums of the year list when that does come out because, there was lots of good music released this year and, just looking at a list like this or, anyone's worst of the year list might give you the impression that this year didn't have any good music going for it, which isn't really the case. Of course, here today I'm counting down the 5 worst albums in my own opinion. I'm not saying that these are the 5 worst albums ever that was released in this year. I'm just saying out of all the albums I heard this year, these were the 5 worst, really. Now, when I listen to music throughout the year, I tend to focus on artists that I like. I don't go out of my way to listen to music that's, bad or like music I anticipate will be bad or music that, other people, other critics I see on YouTube say is bad. If I see someone say an album is bad on like a review or something, I'm not going to look it up and listen to it really. Because, just for obvious reasons. So for that reason, much of my, the albums I review throughout the year, most of them tend to be, good to, just average a lot of times. I don't really get that much, trash albums I have to review throughout the year just because I do mostly focus on artists that I do like. Hence why I'm only doing a top 5 as opposed to like a top 10 or a greater number like that. Just because if I was to include more than 5, like 10 or so, we really just start getting into some average albums as opposed to, bad albums. I really want to focus on bad albums here because, I don't really feel like it's fair to put, a more average album on a worst of the year list or anything like that. Also, my, album picks, they had to have been released, obviously, in 2017 sometime. I actually had to have heard the album, meaning that if I didn't hear the album, it can't be on this list, obviously, regardless of how many bad things I've heard about it, maybe from other reviewers or something like that. I just can't make an exception and put it on this list because of what other people said. I actually had to have heard it in order to put it here on my list. And if for some reason there's an album that you heard this year that was worse than any of the ones on this list, I'm kind of happy I'm not talking about it here on this list because, I probably don't want to hear it if it's worse than any of the albums I'm talking about here. But yeah, this is just my own opinion. If you like any of these albums, that's perfectly okay. But let's get into this list now. First up on my list, we have Evolve by Imagine Dragons. This is this band's 3rd studio album. All the albums that I'm going to be talking about here in today's list, I've either reviewed on my channel before in a full-length review, or in one of my 2, catch-up segments I do throughout the year where I talk about albums I didn't give a chance to, give a full review to them. This is one of those that was in one of those catch-up segments, so I really didn't get to talk about it a ton. But overall, there really wasn't much for me to say about this album, honestly. Other than that, it was a pretty boring pop rock album from a band that, I initially expected a lot more from, given that, I did kind of like this band when they dropped their first album back in 2012, I believe it was. Around that time, I think they had potential, but obviously by this point, I really don't feel like that potential is still, the potential is still there. I just don't feel like they're going to execute it ever because, this album is just full of tons of boring pop rock tracks, songs like Thunder that are just really redundant and boring, songs that are just very awkwardly put together, that occasionally try to incorporate, heavier rock elements at times, just in a very awkward manner, like, trying to still, have that rock appeal, but at the same time that very poppy, mass appeal type thing going on for it, and it just doesn't really work for this album. Overall, it's a really boring, uninteresting pop rock album, and there was many other albums this year, and just in general in this genre that released that were a lot better than this, so I recommend you check those out instead of this project, because overall, yeah, this wasn't good. Coming in at number 4 on my list, we have the self-titled album from Prophets of Rage. Prophets of Rage being a supergroup formed out of members of, Rage Against the Machine, Public Enemy, and Cypress Hill. And as I mentioned in my initial review of this album, I was familiar with Public Enemy and Rage Against the Machine, not really as much Cypress Hill, though I do know, enough to go into this project, understanding the significance of all these artists kind of coming together. And, I was pretty excited to hear what they were going to do on this album here. But overall, this is just easily one of the most forgettable and boring albums I've had to sit through this year. And initially when I reviewed this thing, I gave it more of an average score than a bad one. That's really kind of how I felt at the time. But, even just a couple days after my initial review of this thing, I could barely remember anything specifically about these tracks or anything that was going on this album in greater detail, other than that it was, unmemorable overall. And, that's just really disappointing, given that, just the artists involved in the creation of this album, they all came from very successful groups, groups that were very impactful, particularly in, politically charged music. And that's another thing. The politics on this album just aren't, or just the anger that should be on this album isn't really there. It sounds more like, a very basic Twitter diatribe that someone went on, in terms of the lyrical content, rather than, something that's really, anger-inducing and just, gets you pumped up and wanting to start a revolution or something like that. I don't get that feeling when listening to this project. It kind of just really sounds like they phoned it in here just because, there are a bunch of artists from a bunch of very popular acts, and, just the political climate in the United States right now is just, it's so easy to make a political song nowadays. It's just so many easy targets to go at. I feel like they were just, they were just pretty much, riding off both of those facts at the time, and just hoping that this album would just kind of come together, which really didn't happen, because while I agree with much of what they're saying here on the project, it's just really presented in an uninteresting manner. I've heard these messages told to me better by many other artists this year, and a lot better projects, pretty much. So why would I revisit this one? The instrumentals, while occasionally are alright, I guess you could say, they don't really stand out as being, super awful or anything. They're just very unmemorable, uninteresting, definitely not rage-filled, just really, kind of, annoyed, I guess it would be the best way to describe it. At times, maybe not even that quite at all. Sometimes maybe even a bit more laid back than it should be. Overall, yeah, this was a really unmemorable album, especially given, like I said, the artists involved in this. And overall, for that reason, I do have to include it here on this list, just because I really see no reason to return to this project when there's so many artists, other artists out there delivering this message better. Or, you could just revisit these artists of other projects that they originated from. You could revisit those albums, and they're going to, give you pretty much the same thing, the same kind of message, the same sort of sound at times, but do it in a lot better of a way than this album does. Coming in at number 3 on my list, we have the newest album from Macklemore, Gemini. This project is just, if I had to sum it up in one word, it would be corny, honestly. This album easily begins with one of the worst album openers I've heard just ever, honestly. The guest feature on this first track that begins right at the start of this song, the first thing you hear on this album, is just painful to listen to. And it perfectly, tells you what you're in for the rest of this project. You have a lot of, really uninspired tracks here, some of them trying to sound, very popular with, trap-sounding instrumentals and things of that sort. They just kind of come off as, like I mentioned before, corny or silly or things like that. You have some, tracks that are a bit more personal, which is probably the stronger point of this album, the more personal tracks. But even then, they're just not super interesting, or they're not super memorable. They don't really draw me back to them. You have tracks like Marmalade, which is just a blatant rip-off of another song. Overall, yeah, this album, like I said, corny is the best way to describe it overall. Lots of corny bars on this thing. Just unmemorable tracks, or either that they're memorable for all the wrong reasons. It's not an album I'll be revisiting. Yeah, not good. At number 2, we have Revival from Eminem, and this pains me to put it here on this list because I am a fairly large Eminem fan, I would say. I do like a good amount of the guy's music. He definitely has had his low points in the past, but I didn't expect number 2 on my worst albums of the year list to be the quality of his newest album, which I just recently reviewed this thing only a couple weeks ago. If you want me to go into a lot more detail, I recommend you check out that review because, I can't fit it all into these couple of minutes. I could talk about it here. But honestly, in that review, I was just going through, pretty much every aspect of a hip-hop album. The beats, the lyrics, the flows, the subject matter, just all that stuff, the features, all these aspects of a hip-hop album. Pretty much in all of those categories, Eminem messes up, the majority of the time here on this project. Bad features throughout this thing. Just artists that I would never have wanted to hear on an Eminem project ever, and they don't surprise me pleasantly on this thing either. At best, they're just kind of tolerable. His flows, while occasionally are okay, lots of times he falls into this sort of, stuttered kind of, start-stop, really annoying type flow that I don't particularly like from Eminem. I usually prefer his older kind of flow from back, way back on his older projects. Lyrical subject matter is just, either redundant or just filled with really corny lines throughout this thing as well. Either, he's talking about, his relationship with women or his daughter again. It's the same stuff that we've gotten from him before in the past, but not, exactly putting a new spin on it or anything like that to make it interesting. Or, like I kind of mentioned, there's so many bad lyrics on this thing. Just so many awful lyrics. I can't even get into it right now. The beats on this thing, once again, really corny, just don't really go well with, just having a well put together project. The beats are just not good overall, I guess I would say. So pretty much everywhere where this project can mess up, it messes up for the majority of the album runtime. Like I said, there's occasional moments here where you get a good flow or maybe a clever lyric or something like that. Or even just the opening track on its own, like I mentioned in my review, isn't that bad, away from the context of the rest of the record. But as a whole, Revival is not a project I will ever be revisiting again in the future. And it's also just such a long project too. It's such a pain to listen to. So yeah, I can't really justify having it any, lower on this list or not on this list at all, just given all that stuff. It's definitely Eminem's low point, in my own opinion. And number 1 on my list, we have Maroon 5 with their newest studio album, Red Pill Blues. I mean, when I heard this album was announced, I knew this thing was probably going to end up somewhere here on this list. Like I mentioned earlier on in this video, I usually don't go out of my way to listen to bad music or anything like that. And, with Maroon 5, I do like their older material. Like, from their first couple of albums, I do really enjoy what they had going on there. It wasn't the greatest thing in the world, but it was enjoyable. But over time, they just gotten worse and worse. And I feel like the project before this one, 5 or V or whatever it was, that was kind of the low point at the time. And this album, I don't necessarily think it goes lower than that album in terms of quality, but it doesn't get better. It's definitely, on par with that album in terms of quality. So, really bad in my own opinion. This thing is easily one of the most boring, uninteresting albums that I've just ever heard, ever. Like, this thing is so, pop, polished, squeaky clean, over-sterilized, type of sound that just isn't pleasant to listen to at all. It barely sounds like a band. It doesn't sound like a band. I'm going to just say that. It doesn't sound like a band. It sounds like Adam Levine and a bunch of producers made the tracks here on this thing, because, the rest of the band, I don't know, they're on the album cover, so I guess that's what they're getting paid for this album. Like, is that their only contribution to this thing? Because that's the only contribution I really see. Like, occasionally you'll get a guitar part or something that pops up here on this album, but I could just as well believe that this was made by some session musician or something like that than a member of the actual band, because what's added to the album isn't particularly interesting. It doesn't really sound human. And that's another thing about this album. It doesn't sound human. It sounds almost like a robot kind of trying to comprehend humans, like human emotions and things like that, and trying to make an album out of it, but it just doesn't work. It's just not good overall. The features on this thing don't really add anything to this project at all. Sometimes they make it worse even. And that's not even getting into the deluxe edition of this thing. I don't even want to go there. We're just focusing on the standard edition here today. But yeah, and also ending up with that 11-minute long Maroon 5 track, which is just a jam session for the last 8 minutes of that track, why was that ever done? Easily one of the worst musical moments that I've encountered this year was just the ending of this album. It feels like the instrumental of the album just kept going, even though the album was supposed to stop. It didn't get the memo that the album was done and just kept playing for a good while. That's pretty much what the end of this album is. Easily the worst album I've heard this year. Definitely not an album I'll be rechecking anytime in the future. Really little redeeming qualities to this thing. I mean, it runs for a normal album length. It's structured, I guess. Those are the only positives I can give this thing, honestly. And those are the bare minimum that you need for an album. This was not a good album at all. Easily my least favorite album of the year. Worst album of the year, in my own opinion. I'm done talking about it. I'm never going to talk about this album again, hopefully. So let's move on. Yeah. Those were my 5 worst albums of the year. Once again, my own personal opinion. If you disagree with me, if you like some of these albums, that's perfectly fine. Enjoy them. I'm happy you can get enjoyment out of them, even though I can't. Yeah. And after this video, I'm just going to go rethink my life, because, the fact that I had to listen to this much bad stuff this year, the fact that there's other reviewers out there that, listen to more bad stuff, it It boggles me, honestly. Yeah, these albums weren't good. I don't recommend you check these out. If anything, I recommend you avoid these albums at all costs, unless any of the things I described them as interested you for whatever reason. Yeah, that's really it, though. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this countdown, make sure you guys leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on other music-related content, as well as other year-end lists, which we're kind of in the middle of my year-end list. Right now, so if you like those, once again, make sure you check out that playlist in the description down below. Check out the ones I've already put out, and subscribe, like I said, so you don't miss out on the ones coming out in the future, particularly my best of albums for the year, because once again, if you're gonna hear my opinions on the worst albums, you also gotta check out the best albums, because there was a lot of great albums released this year that I highly recommend you check out. So check out that video if you want to find out what those are. Comment down below your thoughts on either of these albums, my ordering of these albums. What did you think of them? Did you like them? Did you not like them? Thanks for watching, guys, and stay golden.